you everyone for joining us on this great afternoon. We'd love to talk about McKibben, and we had the opportunity to go through his life as like a timeline in this presentation, as we have one author. So this is his life through his books. So this is the order of which we'll be presenting. And I'd love to start off with a passage from this book, The End of Nature. And as I'm reading it, I'd love for you to think about how you relate to this passage. Almost every day, I hike up the hill out my back door. Within 100 yards, the woods swallow me up, and there is nothing to remind me of human society. No trash, no stumps, no fence, not even a real path. Looking out from the high places, you can't see road or house. It is a world apart from man. But once in a while, someone will be cutting wood farther down the valley, and the snarl of the chainsaw will fill the woods. It is harder on those days to get caught up in the timeless meaning of the forest, for man is nearby. The sound of the chainsaw doesn't blot out all the noises of the forest or drive the animals away, but it does drive away the feeling that you are in another separate, timeless wild sphere. Now that we have changed the most basic forces around us, the noise of that chainsaw will always be in the woods. So that's kind of a glimpse of how Bill, his writing style is like. This book, if you Google it, is always cited as the first popular work on climate change for the general audience. So this book brought fame for many people around the world and alerted a lot of people on this issue. And his basic point is that humans have so altered the planet that not an inch is beyond our reach. So at this time in 1989, there is no consensus, definitely within the public, of whether or not global warming has started, And this book addresses issues such as rising sea level, the ozone layer opening, increasing carbon dioxide, the greenhouse effect, which is actually like what was known as climate change, was just the greenhouse effect at the time. And McKibben also talks about consumerism and how that's kind of a point that he touches on of how consumers can fight back against these trends. So this book is a lot about the trends that he's seen and what that means in the future. And he makes a lot of predictions. This is a groundbreaking piece of work because he's kind of the first one who predicted stuff, and a lot of this came true today. So that's the impact and legacy of this book, it as in a whole. Okay. And so McKibben titles his book "The End of Nature," right? That's definitely something that catches your eye. It's meant to grab the attention of the audience. The end of nature, and I thought he wasn't going to get like that much into like that particular phrase in itself, but he actually goes a lot into what started the end of nature and what is contributing, how it's happening right now, how humans are ending nature, how nature has already ended. And that was a pretty bold take, in my opinion. And it all comes down to how McKibben defines nature in the first place. So nature is something that he says existed long before humans, and nature is something that is completely independent from humanity, and nature is something that has been untouched by humanity. Nature is something that is dependable, reliable, predictable. So that is nature to McKibben. And how nature has died is that human activity has so impacted nature that nature has not become nature anymore, has become new nature, and this new nature is basically just not the earth we live on anymore. So that is McKibben's take on nature. I'm not sure if I 100% agree with it. It's particularly the part where he maintains that humanity is distinctly separate from nature. But I think we are definitely a part of nature, and I'll talk about that more in later slides. So, McKibben, this book is really bleak in delivery. It's very depressing. It's hard to get through, not because it's dense. It's clear, but it's a depressing read. Especially when he talks about all these effects that are happening to nature, to birds, to eagles, as an example. But the thing is that, like, when you read this, of course you want to do something about the changing world, but McKibben isn't very clear on what we should do. It's kind of just like, things are pretty bad. It's like, okay. And I think a big part of that, I think there's two big parts to that. One is McKibben's background. So McKibben, he's born in Palo Alto. His family moves to Boston. He goes to Harvard. When he graduates Harvard, he starts to write for The New Yorker. Yes, The New Yorker. Yeah. And when he writes this book in '89, he's a 29-year-old. So this book, it definitely comes off to me as a writer that isn't the most mature, especially because there is no clear call to action. These few quotes that I bullet here come from like the very tail end of the book, and he quotes Walter Truett Anderson, and the quote is, "We find now that human predicament is not quite so devoid of inherent purpose after all. To be caretakers of a planet, custodians of all its life forms, and sharpers of its and our own future is certainly purpose enough." And to that quote, McKibben's like, this depresses me of most of all, because we should not be custodians of the earth. That is depressing. We should limit ourselves voluntarily, choose to remain God's creatures instead of making ourselves gods. And a part of that God complex that he says we shouldn't obtain concerns over genetic engineering, also known as bioengineering, which he briefly mentions throughout this book, but to me it's kind of like a red herring. So this is McKibben's like wishy-washy like take on what we should do, because like he says we should do something, but it was unclear to me after reading this what I should do. So the reason why I mentioned McKibben's background as like going to Harvard and growing up like well off is because I think a lot of this comes off to me as like privileged, from a privileged standpoint. And because McKibben maintains that humans are like not part of nature, that says that we shouldn't care about nature. What he should have done was paint a picture that humanity is so intertwined with nature that it is our responsibility to sort of protect it, restore it, not harm it. But that's not very clear. You know, McKibben even cites John Paul Sartre's neutral purposelessness. He's a existentialist nihilist. So that position is kind of like, you know, so to me it was kind of like, what? Like, that's the takeaway? Yeah. So in the beginning of this PDF was a note from a 2005 version of McKibben. These are a few quotes from the very beginning of the introduction. He says, "The story has played out as I expected." So clearly things have planned out as he had written in 1989. I'll just read it. It is the contrast between the pace at which the physical world is changing and the pace at which human society is reacting that constitutes the key environmental fact of our time. I spent every day since this publication praying that this book would be proven wrong. Those prayers have not been answered. So it's clear that he looks back and he's like, yeah, I kind of called it, and it's kind of sad. And he did mention in this 2005 edition that he reads part of his initial writing as immature, and he said he cringes at it. So I mean, I definitely see that too. So I'm sure that McKibben's stance on what he wrote in '89 has changed in some sense, particularly on what we should do as activists and environmentalists. Yeah. Cool. So, has anyone heard of the band Talking Heads? Okay. Yeah. So it's a few people, right? So I grew up with this band, and throughout this whole class actually, and also reading this book, I was reminded of this song called "Nothing But Flowers," which is just like a satirical take on a post-apocalyptic world in where the revival of nature is taking over all humanity. So
You're gonna play it, right?
yeah, I was gonna play just a few seconds of it, but just like this part. But yeah.
How long is the piece?
I mean,
4
that's an
minutes
ad.
and 23 seconds?
That's an ad.
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, I think you can play all of it.
Just play all of it?
If
Great.
you think it, adds to the artistic experience.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to pay point attention to like this very last thing here. As things fell apart, nobody paid much attention. It's kind of like the main like bang of the song. It's like, yeah, they're real estate, and now it's only daisies and fields. Like, oh, this is terrible. Like, yeah, I think. I mean, this song was released in 1988, so a year before McKibben's book. And so, like, definitely during this period, people were paying more attention to nature, and I thought it was kind of funny the contrast between the end of nature and then this is like nothing but nature, but they both talk about the same thing. So here are some of the similarities I saw. Commentary on the changing state of the globe and how humanity has a big part in that. I think a big part of it was like consumerism and also convenience. So like, oh man, we're missing out on Pizza Huts and Dairy Queens, 7-Elevens. And that plays all part in consumerism. And McKibben talked about it in his book, like, also car culture. It's like, Americans should drive smaller cars and stuff like that. It's like, anyway. And also, something I noticed in both of these is definitely, it's from a Western perspective, like, the talking heads didn't talk about chain stores in China or anything like that. And also, they both like lacked like a big call to action. Like in the song, it was just kind of like, yeah, poking fun at like, what a terrible world it would be to like live in oases. So it's the plural. So I thought that was a fun little connection there. And I think a year after, when a lot of people read McKibben's book, put a lot of perspective and frame into what the song was talking about. Okay, my overall thoughts on the book, I mean, it's definitely irrefutable that this book was groundbreaking in many ways, as it was the first book to call highlight on climate change and really captain a lot of these terms that we now know today. While I was reading it, I mean, obviously it was 40 years ago, so a lot of the things were outdated, but it was remarkable to see that how much he had right all the way back then, and it's definitely an important book. Just some of the little things that I had to say about this book earlier, like how McKibben has, a very religious outlook on a lot of things. He was kind of questioning how our relationship with God would change if we altered nature this much, and he really thought we shouldn't have that much of a role in turning back what we've done wrong with nature, which I don't agree with. I don't know. To me, it was like if you have that much of a religious outlook, shouldn't it be our responsibility? Because like a lot of the emphasis is put on humanity in the Bible and religious texts like that. But I know that wasn't his beliefs, and also a lot of the Western centricism in this book. Like, I mean, he did say a lot of things like America is like definitely a leading contributor and stuff, but like he said some weird things about like China and I don't know. Yeah, just like it was so weird. Anyway, so these are my discussion questions. We can touch back later. To be honest, I just wanted to hear the last one, like from the passage I read. His relationship with nature, and I'm sure we all have stories of our own of our relationship with nature and how it might have changed over time. Yeah.
You can hold for us till Thank you.
So, on the pickup where we just left off, but about, I guess this is 20 years after. So in that time period, McKibben went through a lot of changes as a person, obviously, and then also started doing quite a lot of activism and started forming these campaigns in the US as well as abroad. And one of the first things that he notably did was called the Step It Up campaign in 2007. And this was essentially like a coalition he built up, and their main goal was to state this like manifesto or like this goal of cutting carbon emissions by 80% by 2050, which sounds very bold. Very bold, but this is a small clip from a these are community organizers in Vermont that he's worked with, and they're just talking about their experience. I'm going to show a quick clip of that. Right about here.
So I know the story, but I think a lot of people are going to be interested in how this came to be, the whole Step It Up movement.
Well, we all started being part of this, working within the student climate movement.
The idea for Step It Up emerged because through those networks we became involved in this November 4th International Day of Climate Action.
We had also been working with Bill McKibben to organize a 5-day walk across the state of Vermont and calling for real political action on climate change. And the success and energy of that in a local setting while calling for federal action was part of what sparked the idea of these real local movements of really being in the street, engaged with people in communities has a real powerful effect. So those two actions together sort of shaped a lot of the vision for what eventually became Step It Up.
Right, so Step It Up also had a thing where they did a kind of a march type of thing over 5 days, and they walked through, I guess, parts of nature, and this was just to raise awareness for their goal of curbing emissions. And you can see that McKibben has kind of evolved a lot in his role as a climate activist and environmentalist in the global scene. And with that, this is going backwards. So as kind of like a step up from there, in 2008 he formed 350.org, which is an organization he still has a part in today. And essentially what 350.org does is it's another group, coalition of people which essentially believe that anything above 350 parts per million for atmospheric CO2 is unsafe. And that's based off of a study that they cite. And a key action that 350.org did was that in the COP15, which was like the 15th UN climate conference they held in Copenhagen, they were able to kind of organize a global, almost a protest and kind of like a demonstration of their interest in 350, and they were able to just have a lot of demonstrations with signs, as well as things not only in Copenhagen but across the world to send a signal. Did it have any effect? Not really. Copenhagen was kind of known for being a pretty big failure in terms of getting global action done, and it was just kind of like a lot of countries just kind of rowing themselves on the back and patting themselves on the back for sketches to talk about it. And with that, we kind of reached the next book we're going to talk about, which is Earth, not Earth, but Earth with another A. And it's about making life on a tough new planet. And I'll get right into why it's called Earth. Before that, some themes, these are things that I've kind of picked up throughout the course of the book, and it's very heavily influenced by the 2008 Great Recession. Obviously the recession happened, and he happened to be writing the book during this period. These will just kind of affect how he talks about the topics in the book. Another thing was that he talked about a lot of he was very, he placed a big active role in the political climate and the election that happened in 2008 where the people voted in Obama. And with that, he always seems to refer to Al Gore as a climate leader. That's a take. And then finally, he had some simplified facts about the developing world's climate conditions that I will talk about later. So the book is divided into 4 sections, and the first of which is a new world, and each of the sections kind of proceeds in so a new world identifies the symptoms of climate catastrophes. The second one is called, actually that doesn't make sense. I'll just get right into it, and I'll just start with the first one. So a new world, Earth is called Earth because Earth is no longer Earth. That makes a lot of sense, right? He wanted to add an A to kind of signify the fact that we are no longer living on the same planet, and the quote on the bottom almost just kind of says that where he says the planet on which your civilization evolved no longer exists. We don't have that anymore. And he specifically talks about the stability that made our civilization possible is no longer there, and we have to recognize that this Earth is no longer Earth. And to kind of provide evidence of that, he talks about the actual changes that have happened, which he focused on three main things that have happened, which are which is the frequency of extreme weather. So these are storms, wildfires, things like that, just like the rapid increase in frequency, along with the rapid glacier retreat. He talks a lot about the glaciers melting in the Arctic and how this contributes to rising sea levels. And with that, he also talks about ocean acidification and things we talked about in class, shellfish not being able to form their shells properly. And he goes on to say that these are just compounding effects that will happen in the future, where there will be positive feedback loops for both the warming, for increased CO2 releases through permafrost melt, and he also talks about the political debacles a lot. I mentioned before where we talked about the Copenhagen conference for climate change, and he mentions this kind of in many places throughout the book, but especially in this earlier section where he says political action is kind of almost current political actors are almost treating this as a farce, it's not really a threat to them. And finally, he talks about species shrinkage, which is the fact that the literal shrinkage of species. He just mentions the fact that there are animals getting smaller due to the conditions of the climate. There's goats in the Scottish pastures getting smaller. That's really specific, but he seemed to be into that. And he mentions oil. He actually was of the belief at this time period, at least, that oil production had reached its peak. We had kind of peaked in production and consumption, and it would only go down from there because he believed that when we were running out of oil that we could access, accessing the additional oil reserves we have would be immensely unprofitable, so we would stop doing that. But all of these things kind of didn't pan out in the way that he expected. I think mostly because of the developments that have happened in fracking, as well as other ways of oil extraction. So this is kind of a correction that needs to be made on its projections for how oil will pan out in the next 10 years. And we move into the second section of the book, which shifts from talking about the symptoms to kind of diving more into the root cause of why all these things have been happening. And even into the first section of the book, you can see that it differs from the first book we talked about, because the first book was entirely about his thoughts and his his reflections on nature. But now we're looking really at he's diagnosing the problem. Obviously, as a person and an activist, environmentalist, he's had time to kind of process this, internalize it, and is now providing his analysis of why this has been happening. And the reasons he goes to is growth. He talks about the economic system and how for the past 200, 300 years or so, the economic system has been of economic growth, right? We have to grow in order to live. If there's a recession, the solution is growing. We need to grow the economy. And he talks about specifically green investments, how they're kind of hopeful, but they don't really have the sufficient momentum to create the change that is necessary in order for humanity to survive on this new planet. And he mentions that oil still dominates our economic and political spheres. And the quote is up there from Rex Tillerson, because I don't think he would have ever expected that he becomes Secretary of State. And what does this really talk about? It's about the money it's about the money of climate change. He mentions several things about how climate change will affect money and the global economy. And he mentions that first, the biggest thing is that infrastructure needs and costs will rise. This is in the context of anything from seawalls, so New Orleans, all these coastal cities are creating these infrastructural kind of band-aids to try to address climate change. But also this refers to everything else that will come, so trying to fix up American infrastructure that is better prepared for more extreme weather. And the costs will keep rising because climate change will keep bombarding the world with bigger catastrophes. And he interestingly mentions the insurance industry, which I hadn't really thought about before, but if you think about it, insurance is only going to face more ambiguity and uncertainty when it comes to climate change. And insurance is really important because insurance is necessary for doing a lot of things. Any investments in infrastructure, any big projects that are going to happen, need the backing of insurance, or else it's pretty hard to execute without that risk tolerance. So it's really important to note that these big projects that are trying to address climate change can't really happen when insurance is facing so much risk and uncertainty from climate change. And he throws in a little note. I mean, there's a few pages in the book, but he does mention that obviously money is a problem in the face of climate change because there are so many people in poverty, and the conditions and the earnings of these people are only going to go down in the face of greater climate catastrophes. And the quote here talks about, it says, he kind of addresses the fact that he is reducing climate suffering and the losses of people into these numbers, because he callously reduces the danger we face to dollars, because he says that money in our system and how we recognize the world is the information and how we process things. And you could agree with that or you could disagree with that, but it's just one way of looking at it. That's his perspective at this point. It's called Icarus because he talks about how economic development has come so high and we are going to fall. He mentions a key point in the Carter administration where American peoples began to see the potential of limiting growth. And what this means is that Carter administration placed some kind of limits to economic growth when it comes to the economic situation because of things we were having a oil crisis and we couldn't access oil very well. So he would do things like we would place a 55 miles per hour speed limit so we could use less gas, and the thing was that at this point in American society, we had reached kind of a public consensus where on the topic of growth, we had 30% of people supported growth, 30% of people actually did not want growth in terms of economic growth, they would reject anti-growth. And then there was 40% of the public which was uncertain about if growth was what they wanted for the economy. But Reagan happened and we kind of deregulated everything. And that kind of just became a band-aid solution because Carter was trying to navigate economic uncertainties by pushing more of a limit to growth agenda, but Reagan just came and deregulated and pushed for economic growth to be a band-aid for everything, and that solved the problem in that 10, 20 years, but now we're facing the results of all the climate change that have happened since. So essentially McKibben wants to talk about, are we going to burn by driving our economic growth so up high that we're gonna burn, or are we gonna crash down and not be able to manage that fall? So he wants to talk about how we can manage that fall. In the quote, he talks about kind of more of this this logic, and he says on a finite planet that was going to this was going to happen someday. We couldn't keep using finite resources and expect infinite growth, and it's just that our luck has run out while we were on the dance floor. So this is kind of getting more into what he is proposing in terms of how we can address the problems that come from economic growth and that contribute directly to climate change. And what he wants is a economic system that is more stable, slow, robust, and mature. And this extends beyond economic systems. It goes more into their cultural identity and also how we run our society. And he's very anti-big. He doesn't like big things, big government, big projects. And the reason is that it says it in the quote that's in the bottom, but it says that if we have a lot of work to do if we want to survive on this earth, but most of it is actually local action that's very small in scale. And what he says is that if we have a big government that's tasked and has the facilities to do big projects, it's not really useful for our current purpose we need to focus on, which is the localized central solutions for dealing with climate change and changing our way of running our economy. So he terms this we're going to go into maintenance mode, we're not doing big projects anymore, we're maintaining our current systems and our current ways of living to make us more robust. And a big part of that is actually decentralization. So obviously he argues that this is more of a Jeffersonian future, not a Hamiltonian, referring to the fact that Jeffersonian ideals of having a small town and farms and growing your own food, things like that, not the Hamiltonian ideals of centralization. So, and this, he eventually wants this to evolve into functional independence, so where people are able to have their small communities and nurture these communities to be pretty self-sufficient, like they can function on their own, and they don't need to create communities that no longer seek out the abundance and variety that we have today in our consuming culture. Obviously, like, I could go online and see like 500 different types of computers I could buy, but he says that we need to now turn to the essentials of what allows us to function and tone down the variations and abundance in our lives. And maintenance, on the other hand, requires dispersing resources. It's too risky now to bet on a few things because if we can't recover, if we lose, we can't recover, and the odds of losing are going up with climate change. So in the final section, he talks about what this like maintenance, this decentralization, this local community should focus on, and that's two things. The first one is food supply. It's very relevant that Professor Cohen mentioned food or land purchases by billionaires earlier, because right now our food supply, as he describes it, is in great danger. It's getting too hot, and the atmosphere has too much CO2 for even our genetically modified post-green revolution crops. So our yields are going down, and the current global food supply chain is way too interlinked and vulnerable to any type of threat that might happen. Obviously, we saw that in the recent cases of, say, like when Ukraine was under attack, we saw huge spikes in wheat prices and other food commodities. So obviously, it's pretty evident that we have a lot of vulnerabilities in our food chain and how we feed ourselves. And he says that with a shift towards local communities decentralizing everything and becoming functionally independent, we have to shift away from industrial agriculture and actually you combine combine the knowledge of industrial agriculture and local wisdom to be able to create your own food in local communities. The second thing is energy. So we need to feed ourselves, but also heat ourselves and power ourselves. And he says that we need a dramatic reduction in fossil fuel use, like literally immediately. We need to replace that with renewable sources. And the first thing he says is like obviously conservation, and we also need to do local electricity generation. He thinks about this in the form of solar panels, which he doesn't really get too much into the details of that, so that's interesting. But he just mentions that like the cost of maintaining a centralized power infrastructure is really high, which I'm not sure I agree too much with, especially given our recent experiences of having a separate Texas power grid where we don't have power. So we'll see how we can think about that. But he seems a little disconnected with reality when he says in the quote, say you cut your energy use by a quarter, perhaps by turning off the video game console on GTA, then you put some solar panels on your roof, and now you have juice, like, to fuel your life. That's not the solution. It just kind of seems weird he would throw that in there. This is kind of my assessment. We're done with Bill McKibben's thoughts now, but I would give this a 2, so I think that it's a good book, but there are some reservations I want to express in terms of what I thought. The first one is, it's a very, and there are parts of the book where it comes up as very Eurocentric and delicate in how it approaches the facts about the developing world and how it's affected by climate change. Bill McKibben specifically states that he stays away from like anecdotes and personal stories about climate change because he says that it lacks the ability to convey the bigger picture of how different like climate change impacts interact with each other. Which, sure, that's true, but also he like does not include any nuanced anecdotes about how people in these communities in the developing world actually respond to climate change. And he always states it in a way that's like, if you look at it on the top right corner, he like references like, this is the first part of it is in reference to a peasant in China, and he says like, oh, in my village, when a girl was preparing to marry, the first thing the parents checked was like, will the back wall be hot or not? Because that's an indicator of like, if they're wealthy enough to be, to keep the house warm. And then the next one talks about a Congolese hut, like where, like you have to burn coal or something. And these seem like very like oversimplified, like almost like these aren't even real stories. He's kind of throwing it in there because he wants to kind of show that he understands or like at least is paying attention to these things happening in the developing world, but doesn't really show any real connection or like deep thought into that. The next thing I want to look at is he has so many analogies throughout the book in terms of like expressing his argument, but a lot of them don't seem all that functional, and it gets to a point in some parts where it feels like he's just writing the analogies to like almost just entertain himself. Like in the bottom, he talks about, I think this is in reference to, like he says, in some sense, we're the owners of a national government, then like more national government than we can actually use. It's sort of like the 95% of SUV owners who never like navigated, explored, or Yukon off the paved surface. And if you're not defending the free world or paving your continent, you probably don't need the 2-liter clearance in a V8 engine. So this is like one of the examples, and it's like entertaining at least, but there's too many of them, and there's like different variations of this he always harps on, and I think that kind of distracts from the point he really wants to get at. And the last point is like, he like really has a thing for like Chinese peasants, and he just keeps telling these like fake stories he probably never heard. I'm confused by why he would do that. So yeah, and with that, that's the end of my evaluation. 2 questions I want to leave you with. The first one is, do you agree with McKibben's vision for non-growth, decentralization, and globalization as a way to effectively combat climate change, and why not? The second one was, what makes his arguments particularly convincing, or if they're not, why is it not convincing? So we can come back to these at the end, but that's it, and I will pass it on to Kenna.
Okay, so there's a 20-year gap in between the end of nature and Earth, and then there's I guess, yeah, like about a 9-10 year gap between Earth and his latest book, I believe, Falter. So kind of what he did in that 10 years, a lot of this is through his like 350.org organization, but they did a global work party. So this is like kind of the beginning of like a series. Like they do a bunch of different campaigns. I'm kind of highlighting the biggest ones. This one really emphasized local action against climate change. You can kind of see they take like a different kind of stance or like strategy or method of encouragement with each of these campaigns. He was huge in the, like, I'm sure all of us have heard of this in some way or another, the Keystone XL pipeline, Trans-Canada like pipeline, that was huge, like huge news. And then Biden, I think like in one of his first days of office, overturned what Trump had allowed that Obama hadn't, you know what I mean, all these things. So he was a large part of that campaign. And then in 2013, he was awarded the Gandhi Peace Award. And in 2015, he stepped down as board chair of 350.org, so he's been running it since he founded it before the beginning of Earth, and then he's now emeritus status as part of that organization, and so that's a couple years before he wrote Falter. And same year as Falter was the global climate strike through 350, and it was the largest climate mobilization in history. And so that's kind of when, I guess, the era in his world of where Falter takes place. So in the intro, very nicely, he puts that he does not live in a state of despair, which made me feel better about reading it. And he says, if I didn't, I wouldn't have bothered writing what follows. So in this, he essentially introduces, and like David, I think, pointed out, he has a very unique writing style. He really likes analogies, and I think he really likes frameworks. And so in this book, it's kind of centered around this framework or idea that he has of the human game. And so the human game is essentially our entire existence, society, what have you. And he calls it a game because, one, it has no obvious end. 2, does not really matter in the sense that, millions of light years away, nobody will be upset as to whether or not we won our human game or not. And yet, like any game, absorbs the whole concentration of those involved. And so the entire book kind of centers around this idea of what we're doing as playing and continuing the human game, and Falter, he named the book Falter because he says the human game is faltering, right? We are getting to the point where we may no longer be able to play, which would kind of be the, I guess, biggest loss possible in our version of this game. So another key concept that he has in the that like kind of carries through the book is leverage, right? And so I thought an actually good like analogy or example that he gave was essentially like, you know, when let's say the Roman Empire fell, right, or the Mauryan Empire, or all these huge right empires fell at the time. It's not like in China their life was disrupted because they're like deeply disrupted, like irrevocably the same because the Roman Empire fell, right? Like the Roman Empire fell, that was a big deal, but it didn't necessarily reverberate around the world the way it does now. But because of like the scale of our consumption, right, and the scale of our connectivity, we now have the ability, right, to essentially disrupt and possibly end, right, other people's lives through our own personal actions, right, which before were kind of contained by distance. And so that's a very, very large part of what he kind of uses throughout the book. And so the first part is like, I didn't even put a slide for it because I felt like it was probably adequately covered by David and Gabriel's, but it's just kind of the, what I would call the alarmist section of the book. It essentially just repeats all of the stuff that we have been covering in this class about how we are just not in a good place, right? And he kind of goes into detail about a bunch of stuff we know about, like ocean acidification, agriculture, right, carbon. And so the second part, he kind of talks about all these case studies, and would you notice they are very Western centric, and he kind of talks about ourselves as our opposition, right? Like who is really stopping this change? Also us, right? And so like his example with Exxon is how Exxon essentially knew about global warming 10 years before and essentially did not do anything about it and kind of actively promoted disinformation. So, and he wonders, you know, what could we have done had we known 10 years earlier? The Koch brothers, so like Silicon Valley, he goes into a whole thing about that, but I thought something that was very interesting was Ayn Rand's influence. He like writes pretty extensive, like she's like not an insignificant portion of the book is just about Ayn Rand. And so I have never read Ayn Rand. She's Atlas Shrugged, if you guys have heard of that book. She's a pretty famous philosopher, probably for like not like our like 2 generations before us. I think she was a massive influence. For us, like not so much. And then when I read about it, it kind of it makes sense why. So he talks about how she has had kind of like an outsized, possibly, you know, undeserved influence on the people who are in power today. So like there are so many people who, he gives so many examples of like Trump, Paul Ryan, like citing her as their favorite book and their favorite author and having like defined their ideas, right? And she's kind of like some of them, like it's like their guidebook for the way the world works, right? And a lot of her stories are just centered around individualism. Essentially, what benefits me must be right, because if it's right for me, then it's just right. And these stories, he points out, probably would not have been that popular if she had kind of like written some kind of manifesto and like harped on this, but she wrote really melodramatic stories, right, that essentially promote this philosophy, but in story form, right, which is infinitely more compelling to the public, and kind of reflected like how she grew up, because she grew up in communist Russia. Her like father's pharmacy was seized, right, and essentially taken away by people who were claiming to fight for like the better welfare of everyone, right, et cetera, et cetera. And you can kind of see the echoes of it in today's, or at least what was today in the book, Trump in like 2019, 2020. And so this is a quote from her: "There is nothing of any importance in life except how well you do your work. It's the only measure of human value. All the code of ethics they'll try to ram down your throat are just so much paper money put out by swindlers to fleece people." So I was planning to read Atlas Shrugged before I read this book. I don't know if I'm gonna read it anymore. Though, you know, maybe it's, oh, I don't know what that is. Though maybe it's, you know, good to read opinions that you maybe don't share. And like I said, what is good for me is right. And that's a quote from someone else. And then her own response is, "This is the best and strongest expression of real man psychology that I have ever heard." So, great woman. Had a lot of issues if you read the book. Because it's like a mini biography of her within the book. And so he kind of talks about, again, like Rand has influenced these people like the Koch brothers who are influencing Trump, right? And then kind of the way that will also connect to Silicon Valley, right? The people who are essentially like in our country pushing forward innovation and deciding like in what direction that innovation will go. she's kind of like a central figure within all of those case studies. Okay, and then in the third part, so past Ayn Rand, like we've gone through the alarmists, we've gone through Ayn Rand, and all these case studies of like essentially like ourselves as our own threat. Politically speaking, then he talks about like, okay, should we get over climate change? Like what is on the horizon for us? And so in an odd way, like this is the part that makes this book not necessarily just about climate change. I think his previous works are pretty much centered around like climate change as the main thing. I think he named it like Falter and not like Earth or the end of nature or something related to climate, because I think he's just kind of he's trying to make a broader point, I think, about like where we're going as a species irregardless of climate change, which was something I didn't expect. And I think like he kind of like is alluded that he has some concerns about like genetic engineering, and you can see he really goes into it here about his concerns of, right, genetic engineering is one, sure you can fix existing genetic problems, but then second, the argument that we've all heard, designer babies, right, and kind of like goes into what that would look like, the repercussions of that for us. Artificial intelligence, right, like right now we have called like ANI, which is artificial narrow intelligence, so like really, really good at chess, right, and then there's AGI, artificial general intelligence, which is kind of like the AI of sci-fi in like 2100, right, and us living in bunkers underground, a la Terminator. So it's interesting how he kind of goes past climate change, right? Like the other things that we're working on, that we're innovating, like how he thinks that will also cause us to falter in the human game. And then third, he kind of not as in depth as the other two, but he kind of touches on like space relocation, because that's been kind of a response to climate change, right? Like let's go live on Mars. And he just kind of goes into both the impracticality of that, right, but also the fact that like we would rather go to a different planet, and like especially the people who are innovating, right, and kind of like leading thought leaders of our day, right, would rather just go to another planet than treat our current planet better. And so he talks about these things as like everyone knows it's incredibly, incredibly risky. It's kind of like an oddly philosophical book, right? Everyone knows genetic engineering has huge risks, AI has huge risks, space exploration has huge risks in the sense that it probably will not work out. And so he talks about death as one of these things, and he goes into kind of like the grandeurs of immortality that a lot of like Silicon Valley folks entertain, like all these, you know what I mean, like finding a cure to old age startups and things like that. And he spends a good chunk just kind of talking about that, which I think is interesting, but also I'm not sure how much it truly adds to his, I guess, overall argument. And then we arrive to the fourth section. So hope, and he talks about like genetic engineering, AI, space exploration, like even like let's say like bioengineering, right? These are like technologies of expansion, right? And he posits two main things: solar, right, and then nonviolence as technologies of repair. So essentially repairing what we have done rather than prioritizing growth at all costs, I think like is mentioned in Earth. And so solar panels, he goes pretty in depth in. There is like a lot, for someone who maybe says he avoids anecdotes, there are like I feel like a pretty good number of personal anecdotes and like personal stories in his work, which is maybe a result of this being a later work. But he talks about solar panels as affordably green, right? And something that that will eventually, right, be on par and is coming closer every day to being on par with like our standard, you know, oil and gas kind of energy. And so something I just found interesting there was like, he kind of talks about like how we have to prioritize, we have to like, you know, shift our whole like, I guess, theories of growth at all costs, right? And growth is like the only measure of how well an economy is doing or how well we are doing as a society, right? But then his main argument for like, not main argument, but a large part of like why he sees solar panels as the future is like, because they kind of fit within that paradigm where it's like, to some degree, it's like you can afford them, right? It's like financially makes sense, you will make a return on them, right? It's like a new technology, so he kind of, I think there's like a little bit of conflict, right, which is realistic for what he's talking about, but I just thought that was interesting because he kind of calls for them as technologies of repair, but solar panels are kind of both repair and expansion. especially in like off-grid electric, Black Star Energies, like these are not nonprofit companies, right? Like the idea is to make a profit and to help people, right? But I think the reality is that with most things coming our way, there won't necessarily be something that, like, I guess, beautifully harmonious. And then the second technology is nonviolence. And so he sees it as something working alongside like innovations like solar panels, right? And as the quote unquote base technology of most climate movements, like all of these things that 350.org organized, right? Like walkouts, I don't know if you guys participated in walkouts like in high school and things like that, but like, right, those are all like, that is all fundamentally not like following the philosophy of nonviolence. And I think he goes deep into his belief of that as like a core part of of like his hope, right? Which is, to be fair, not like, well, I think like nicely written, I don't think is also like that crazy in terms of what he's saying, because pretty much all activists believe in nonviolence as a way of either furthering their activism, or as like the way that the public can actually take a stand. But then again, it's not necessarily something that has been wildly innovated since like the times of Gandhi, which he touches on. And so like there are things like social media that he talks about as like part of why he's hopeful for that, but it's also, to me, an argument that I think a lot of people have made and is not necessarily extremely new. Not to say that it is not a valid argument. Okay, and so then he ends with this kind of like final call upon human psychology, right? Like resisting what benefits one, and deepening like in us, right? What like calls upon us to help everyone, right? Which I think is kind of the general philosophy of what almost all of solution-oriented like readings, books, articles we've seen. And something he said that was interesting when he's talking about like case studies, all these people who are kind of like the antithesis of this, like Ayn Rand, is like when you think with greed, you assume everyone else thinks with greed, right? And I think that's really like in his mind, like kind of the core issue of like Ayn Rand's thing, is that like that individualism is kind of intertwined with greed, and when you feel that way and think that way, you assume everyone else feels and thinks that way, and then the whole world kind of slowly becomes that way if you're the one in power. So that is it for us. Oh wait, okay, my discussion slide, I guess it's not synced, but my question was, I guess, do you think of like the human game as a helpful framework for thinking about what we're doing, right? And like the repercussions of, you know, our economy, of growth, et cetera, all these things we've talked about. Like, is that helpful, or is that kind of another like analogy that is perhaps entertaining, but not ultimately that helpful? And honestly, I don't like feel strongly one way or the other personally. But okay.
Good thing we walked all the way through, isn't it?
Yeah.
So first of all, round of applause. You can see there's a lot of material to cover when one is talking about Bill McKibben. He, by the way, started yet another movement that's not mentioned here called Third Act, which is an attempt to take everybody who's retired, doing not very much, and organize them so that they get active and do more with respect to saving the planet for everyone else. So we do have a sense that he's facing down older age and trying to sort of figure out what it's all about at a later stage than we begin. So each of you has put questions up here for everybody in the class. If you go back to Gabriel and you go back to your flagged favorite question and see whether we can have audience comment on the favorite question of each of the three of you in the remaining 6.5 minutes on the clock, that would be great. You wanted to hear about personal stories.
Yeah, third one. You guys have anything to share? That'd be just like a fun moment. Or maybe not so fun if it's changed.
More fun than otherwise.
I mean, I could briefly start. Like, second grade, I was at a new school, and like there was like a little wilderness area outside the school, and I used to go after school with my friend. We used to collect these little like plastic beads. I don't know if you guys know it. I forgot what we called them, but they were just like these colored beads everywhere, and like they were just kind of like treasures. But I don't know.
Are these pocket beads that you could string together?
Maybe,
That kind?
maybe, but they didn't have a hole in them. They were just like, yeah, it was just BBs. Yeah. But I don't see them anymore, so it's kind of like, I don't know, just like a magical like childhood moment. I don't know.
When you discovered plastic. I can remember that.
I don't know.
Oh,
Yeah.
so colorful, right?
Yes.
But yeah, but yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know. Actually, it's I don't know. Sorry.
By like my house as a kid, we had like this huge like forest, and like I would walk back from school, and obviously as a child I just thought everything was so big, but now every single time I go home they clear more and more land to build like new suburbs, so the forest is like completely gone, and I have no clue like what it used to look like anymore, which makes me really sad. Like I wish as a child I had some way to like take a video or like a photo of like this like little area that I used to play around in. But yeah, it's all gone now, and now like wild animals are always like, there's always like in our little like next door neighborhood thing like, oh watch out, there's like a bobcat or like something like that, because all these animals that were once in the forest are now, they have nowhere to go, and so now they like potentially eat people's pets and are just roaming around in the suburbs near my house. But
Is this another Houston story?
no, I live in Denton, Texas.
Oh, Denton.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, forest is a big word. I would say like land with a lot of trees. I don't know. I feel like forest is a weird way to describe it. But yes, now it's gone, which just makes me think. It just makes me think about like the nature that I have now, and to like be more cognizant and more appreciative of it, because it's going away.
I recently realized that looking at water or being near water is really calming, and it's a presence that I need more in my life, because I can feel myself being more chaotic or feeling more chaotic without going back to nature sometimes.
I feel like I once used nature as like a source of creativity, like subconsciously, and just over time I've realized like how important it is, and like how much to appreciate it. And another thing, I'm a babysitter, and my favorite thing to do is take kids outside, because they're always so excited to go outside. For one, it's just like so cool to watch their like amazement with like the world around us, and like it's interesting how that changes over time.
Thoughts?
I grew up going to Lake Tahoe a lot, and in past years when I've gone back, like you can see on the beaches that there's more and more people. And at first I was thinking like, oh, like it's just becoming a more popular spot in the summer, and then I realized that it's because the beaches are growing, because the water line is going down so far that they've now almost doubled in size from when I was like 8 or 9, which is kind of crazy. So it's kind of just not necessarily in the same sense that like you're watching suburban crawl, but you're seeing like indirect effects of like action in less like natural communities affecting a really beautiful natural place.
David, your favorite question?
Yeah. Mine's probably the first one, because he presents like a pretty interesting perspective that we should. He has a position of de-development, which is not really taken very often in mainstream politics or like economics. So, y'all, what do y'all think? Like, any hot takes? Y'all agree? Disagree? Why? Raise your hand if you're like, yeah, we should keep growing, like our economy's forever, and we should just keep going. Nobody. So everybody wants to decentralize and, you know, localize their communities. Or it's somewhere in the middle, like what do you think?
He has sort of an extreme, like, perspective of wanting to be very Jeffersonian. Like, I think Jefferson would have wanted and make that happen, you know, in 2022, 2023. Like, I don't think that that's gonna happen, but, I think that definitely like more of an individualized, sort of like grassroots approach might, you know, be something that we could at least do, because, you know, tackling big bad oil companies would be too hard to start with.
Last comment of the day. Fortunately, not last comment of the term. And I might say, when we open on Wednesday, if you've had further thoughts about all this, particularly this one, which really couples a lot of things that we might want to take apart and look at more slowly, we can begin with, you know, a second shot at this question. But is there a last thought before we close?
I mean, I think there is something, like there, with like urbanization and like how connected our world is, there are a lot of pros with being able, like not every community, not every part of the world can produce or make the same things. So there is something to be said about like this grand connectivity that we have. Obviously there are a lot of environmental effects, but I feel like figuring out a way to like weigh out the pros and then also the cons is something that I don't think has been solved yet, and I think will take a while to solve. I feel like maybe if things can be produced within a community, then stopping importation of other things would be like a great place to start. But I don't think, to live the same comfortable life, we're definitely not gonna be able to just like make everything local. So there's gonna be a lot of sacrifice that comes with like localization.
But don't forget, he's about ratcheting down an economy to one that is essentially focused on, quotes, essentials.
That's true.
Cross, which wasn't so good. So he doesn't care if you have fewer choices, even if you do.
That's true.
So something to think about. I might just suggest one thing about him that I found interesting over time, and that is he began as a very religious person whose views about what could be done and should be done under God's image were pretty well restricted by his view of what it was to be a good Protestant as he was brought up. And he's walked back all of his interest in religion. And in a certain sense, because he's so messianic, he's so message driven, you know, he's so focused on what we should do as good human beings, I think he's spent the rest of his adult life trying to replace religion with a set of secular beliefs that can function in lieu of religion as very, very strong claims, moral claims on everyone's attention. So it makes him less likely to be supple, you know, less likely to be, what about this plus that? He's very focused on a few things, which I think goes back to his early focus on religion. You know, what would God want us to do? Not everything, perhaps something. We should be modest. Those kinds of things are now being translated into his secular life. And that doesn't necessarily fit with everybody else's views, either religious or secular.
I was gonna say that, like mentioning the God argument, I think we need more like religion and like environment. I feel like they kind of, like from somebody who is a Christian, the idea of like how would God want us to treat his earth is so interesting and something that I've like never heard anyone argue. And I feel like that would be like a really interesting like point. As someone who was, or you said he is Christian, right?
Bumper sticker, it's not around anymore, so
Yeah.
and the bumper sticker said, you know, if God came to earth, she'd be pissed.
Yeah, I think she would be. She'd
Have that
hate it.
for one. See you guys.